By way of my introduction, I also want to acknowledge the land we are on. I think it's an important political movement and decision to also make, to acknowledge the issues that we're raising and discussing first and foremost as well. My talk is entitled, the paper that I've written for this particular collection is actually entitled Troubling Inclusion and Diversity, Tracing the Promises and Limitations of the Canadian Forces Diversity Strategy for Indigenous peoples. So the Canadian Forces has really come up recently with a new diversity strategy. So my paper tackles those ideas around what are the promises and limitations, not only for Indigenous peoples, but for employment equity seeking groups in general to understand what's taking place there. And have we moved the conversation in any kind of meaningful way? By way of this particular presentation, however, I want to expand our minds a little bit to thinking about other aspects of this work that touch on this work. So you'll see me going into a number of different directions, but coming back to the ideas of what we can pull out perhaps of this notion of diversity and inclusion and how to problematize those concepts at an institutional level, which I think are so fundamental. So I want to start off with a quote by Sarah Ahmed, who says, every research project has a story, which is a story of an arrival. And I've got to be very honest, I'm very curious at how we've all arrived at this particular place, to be able to ask these particular questions at this particular point in time. To let you know how I've come to this particular place, there have been a number of different trajectories that my work has taken. And always percolating at the back has been a curiosity around military operations, security measures, warfare, especially intensifying after 9/11. I also have to out myself in terms of being a sociologist. I also dabble in a number of different areas interdisciplinary-wise, so you'll see that this presentation is also inflected by some kind of historical discourse, critical human geography, which also takes place here, and a number of different places where I dabble in to come to the analysis that I do. I'm also a critical race scholar. I find myself really dabbling into both North American scholars with respect to understanding how relationships of multiculturalism are taking place not only in Canada, but also in the North American context. And I think that this is what brings me to this particular point in time for this presentation, is to understand how do we understand this sort of Canadian discourse around Canadian multiculturalism alongside issues of indigeneity. How do we begin to have these conversations? So what does it look like not only within our institutions, but what does it also look like, let's say, for example, Indigenous people on the ground who are organizing with Black Lives Matter, right? So how are these conversations taking place not only within the institutions, but outside as well? So by virtue of me coming to this particular project, I was really interested in the take-ups by various authors and various theorists on the Somalia affair. How was this taken up in the Canadian political moment in 1993? And I think there was a lot of framing of what this particular event, what kind of meaning it should have, and how do we understand the take-up of this. The less known fact in, I would say, in Canadian polity would be the idea that we've never really engaged with the fact that the two men that were both dishonorably discharged and charged in the Somalia affair for the murder of a Somali teenager were actually Indigenous. They were actually Cree. And when we understand that, does that change our understanding of what's transpired? So the questions I ask here then are, what might we see if the Somalia affair was from the vantage point of Kyle Brown and Clayton Matchie? Does our perspective change when the media framings of this event are altered to center the lives of these Cree men? What do we see then? Admittedly, this is an entirely different project, but at the same time, no less relevant for how I've arrived at this particular moment. To ask then the questions, I became really interested in the examination of the lived contradiction of citizenship among both soldiers of color and Indigenous soldiers in the Canadian military. This notion of the lived contradiction of citizenship. What is it about the meaning that takes place around building the lives of these men and women? So fundamentally, some of my previous work asked the question, how might we understand the racial underpinnings of citizenship, but more importantly, how is it lived among soldiers in the Canadian military? Specifically, how do racialized soldiers experience the Canadian military, and what do their experiences say about the practice of war? Now, when I talk about this notion of the lived contradiction of citizenship, I do realize the nuances between centering the figure of the racialized soldier, let's say, and let's say the one of the Indigenous soldier. And for that reason, a lot of people have asked me in my previous work, did you interview Indigenous soldiers for this work? I really wanted to, but because precisely I'm located in Toronto and in urban space, it becomes quite difficult with respect to the access, with respect to soldiers in that sense. But then coming through this project, I realized these are two very different projects as well. And I think I really want to hold that in constellation as I go through. One of the things that came up in my work with soldiers of color in the Canadian military was all of this promise around diversity. What do we mean by diversity? How is it conceptualized? How is it manifesting itself through a particular institutions? So I ask here then a couple of questions for you. What are the promises and limitations of institutional diversity discourse in the Canadian Armed Forces? So how is the CAF taking up this notion of diversity? What work is diversity doing? How do racialized soldiers negotiate national belonging amidst a climate of diversity? So how do Indigenous soldiers do this as well? When they see this notion of these pushes for diversity within the institution itself, how is this navigated? And finally, does diversity discourse, I think it's really important to ask this question, does diversity discourse, as we understand it, include Indigenous peoples? And then finally, what power relations are disrupted or remain intact through the deployment of diversity discourse? So are we really shaking things up by virtue of using this language, the issues of diversity, or are things remaining in some form, albeit a little bit differently, status quo? My previous research was actually divided into 3 different sections. So one was actually looking at people's journeys into the military, and then how they negotiated the military culture itself, and then what were their journeys in deployment. And one of the things that I was always fascinated about, especially around 2008, when there was also a push for diversity in the CAF, were these diversity recruitment advertisements. And I really go to talk about what are we trying to say in this particular story? What are the narratives that we're trying to understand through these particular recruitment posters? My data actually reveals a little bit of a different story. So I kind of liken these posters as kind of like the posed family photo in a particular way, but what's happening behind the family photo, I think, is also something to interrogate. So also to borrow from Fanon, I also look at the military encounter as a racial encounter. In my particular study, what ended up becoming really sort of apparent was the idea that racialized soldiers' experience in the Canadian Forces revealed the following. The military is fundamentally a white space, not just in terms of culture, but also in terms of geography. So through my interviews, what I would hear is that it's so white. It's very white here. And then I would ask for explanations of what this looked like, and I'll give you a few quotes around this. The soldiers negotiate this space in a number of ways, but mostly by accepting racism as a term and condition. And I think this is really, really, really important when trying to understand what diversity is trying to do within an institutional framework. Occasionally naming it. What is striking is how much they have to come to terms with it to survive. So let's look at Shannon. She says, Go to Kingston and you'll see what's important. And it's the CF, it's hockey, and it's darts. You know, that's been my experience, and those are the sports of interest to your typical white person in the military. So they set up social events around those things, right? So while you can sit here by yourself and have no friends, or you can get in there and throw a rock down the ice and have a beer and just try to like it, because that's what the dominant crowd is doing. That's kind of what I mean by just fitting in, just kind of accepting what already exists and trying to be a part of it. So I ask, did you ever find that really difficult at times? Were there moments where you were like, I can't do this anymore? And so she responds, yeah, there are times it's difficult, but you always do it. You don't go into this blind, and it doesn't take long for you to see what the situation is. So either you get out or you make a decision that you're going to stay. Maya, on the other hand, and I think this is a quote that really gets at the crux of this contradiction that I was alluding to at the beginning. She says the following: let me tell you one of my first days when I was in PET. I was driving down the main road because there's just one, and I passed by this tow truck. I'm like saying in my head, oh my God, this is where I live. I actually live here now. I've been in Petawawa before, and I've passed by this tow truck company, and I see a Confederate flag, and it says, proud to be a Hick. And then I cried. I think I had a tear come from my eye. I think it was one of the first days I was in PET, and I was like, this is where I live. Oh my God. But to them, the Confederate flag is not like how I understand it in my head. I'm like, I know the Confederate flag wasn't initially supposed to be a racial thing. But over the years, guess what? And now it's on a business in Petawawa, and I was like, oh God, this is where I live. Got it. I think this is a really sort of important quote to understand. It gets at the crux of this lived contradiction of citizenship. The idea that she is participating in a space where she really wants to belong. She really wants to belong as you go through the transcripts of what she's sort of discussing with me, but at the same time, there are these moments where this belonging is tenuous. I think the also interesting part is to sort of trace the history also of Petawawa itself. The idea that the history of it is that the earliest settlement is in the region was actually inhabited by the Algonquin First Nation, and then became a training base in 1910, I believe. And then during World War I, it was actually functioned as an internment camp. So when we start to see the space take on a particular history around inclusion, we start to also see then how Maya echoes this by virtue of the changes that are happening in the space as well, but no less relevant in her experience. So Blaise says, looking back, I was torn. So he's a retired soldier. On the one hand, I really loved how daily activities we did together, eating together, training together, living together, shooting the shit together, really made us close. We were family, you could say, but stronger than that and weaker than that. But in retrospect, that kind of bonding was important to build trust in the field. I had to trust my guys and vice versa, because we were putting our lives out there for each other. I needed to feel really secure with my guys in order to feel okay in the field. But there were times it all felt a bit much, and I wanted to break out of it all. Unless you're in a combat mission, being a soldier is not a natural thing on the daily. So getting to this issue of diversity and institutional diversity discourse, I was really interested in how soldiers negotiated this as well. So Maya says in relation to certain special days, whether it was sort of Black History Month or whether it's International Women's Day, this is what she'll say. They'll have posters up. I personally just ignore because I don't care, but they have posters up. I'm pretty sure I saw one for Asian Awareness Month. I laughed my ass off. I was like, wow, we got one of those? Why am I not on the poster? There's a Black one, there's a Black History one, of course, there's a Women's one, and the International Day we just had. It was the International Day for the Day Against Racism. So yes, they're big on it for sure. I just ignore most of them because I don't have time for that. The military is open to that, but you also got to wonder why only on those specific days or months. Alfred goes on to say, and I think this is what's really crucial with respect to the issue of diversity, is under diversity discourse, can we name then racism? Can racism be named in these spaces? And I think this becomes really central. So Alfred says, A white female private, less trained than I was, literally applies and she gets the job. And you start to see the layers and layers here. And there's a pattern of that throughout. So you see all of this. You raise your hand, you say what the hell's going on. And they say, oh, you're trying to pull the race card. They go on to say, don't worry, no one is racist. I have a best friend who's black, and so now I'm the one who's responsible. Liza says, I've thought many times about mentioning something about race. The problem is every time you try to bring it up, someone is saying that I'm too sensitive or that I'm playing the race card or making a bigger deal of the issue than needs to be. I have a problem with someone and then it turns into me being the problem. I don't get it. So we start to see then what are the mechanisms in place for people to actually speak about this in a very meaningful way. So when we get to the diversity strategy then, I'm sort of looking through the strategy as it begins to set out, and it has a lovely definition of diversity here that says diversity means respect for and appreciation of differences in ethnicity, language, sexual orientation, education, and religion. It is about understanding each other and moving beyond simple tolerance to embracing, celebrating, and integrating the rich dimensions of diversity within each individual. So I want us to really think about what really is being encapsulated here around the definition of diversity. Again, I go back to that question with respect to what is it doing? So as I write this paper, I'm thinking about this in terms of my previous research, but I've also thought about it in terms of what it might mean then for Indigenous peoples in the Canadian military. So I think what needs to take place, what we need to consider with respect to diversity and this notion of inclusion are the following. We need to have a sustained engagement with the military as an institution and its continuous role in the making of the Canadian nation. So one of the questions I constantly get is, Tammy, why is it that the military is always on the hook for this? Why is it that we're always targeting the military and not, say, let's say, university institutions, economic institutions across society? I think one of the big things that the military has an opportunity here to really hone in on is that the military does a lot of powerful national work. It really does a lot of work with respect to the propagation of nationalism, multiculturalism. So if we can actually hone in on what this actually means for an institution that does that kind of work, the military might actually be a place for a lot of opportunity. I also think, in addition to engaging with how the culture of whiteness is upheld and negotiated, constantly we're always thinking about, let's say, visible minorities, racialized bodies, women, Indigenous peoples, how they can fit in, how they can actually approach, but we never interrogate the dominant culture itself. And I think that is something worthy of interrogation. We also need to trace the contemporary limits of diversity discourse, challenges us to rethink its impact and effectiveness, particularly, if it does not name structural racism or avenues for addressing it. If we have a diversity policy that doesn't allow for those systems to take place, we really need to begin to think about how are we going to address those material effects. It is important to think about the military recruitment as a project of inclusion and how it operates and functions as such. Although I will say, in light of the discussions that have been happening today, I'm starting to think about this in terms of its resistive potential. Finally, what does this mean for diversity? If whiteness is integral to the military, diversity can therefore never mean anything beyond assisting Indigenous peoples and racialized others to learn to function within it. If we never interrogate the dominant discourse of what people are becoming included into, then what we end up seeing is a setup from the get-go. Thank you.